Hi, everyone, and thank you for joining today's webinar on fallbacks for sterling ICE LIBOR swap rate and US dollar LIBOR ICE swap rate. My name is Ann Battle, and I'm head of benchmark reform at ISDA. I'm joined by Arif Merali from the Bank of England, Jonathan Martin, also from ISDA, and Phoebe Coutts from Linklaters. Just as a reminder, today's webinar is being recorded. All registrants will receive a copy of the recording as well as a copy of the slides that we're using today. We will also post the recording and the slides on the public session section of ISDA's website if any of your colleagues or clients would like to review them. If you have questions during today's webinar, we're going to reserve about 15 minutes at the end to answer those questions. You should see a question box in the right-hand panel of your screen. You can enter your questions there and we will answer them probably at the end of the webinar, but we might take a few as they come in. So ISDA recently launched a very straightforward consultation on the fallbacks for sterling and US dollar LIBOR ICE swap rate. On this slide, there is a URL for the consultation and related material. The ICE swap rates are impacted by the cessation and/or non-representative publication of LIBOR, in this case in US dollar and pound sterling. However, because, as we'll come on to, the ICE swap rates use different rate options in the ISDA definitions because they are actually different benchmarks from LIBOR in US dollar and sterling. The IBOR fallbacks that ISDA implemented earlier this year do not apply to derivatives that reference the ICE swap rate. So the outstanding consultation seeks input on the implementation of fallbacks for sterling LIBOR ICE swap rate that were suggested in a paper published by the Working Group on Sterling Risk-Free Rates Nonlinear Task Force, or NLTF. And it also seeks input on implementation of very similar fallbacks for US dollar LIBOR ICE swap rate suggested in a paper published by a subcommittee of the Alternative Reference Rate Committee, or ARRC, in the United States. The consultation is very straightforward. It just asks a yes or no answer regarding whether respondents support the implementation of those fallbacks. However, it is really critical that all market participants who have exposure to the ICE swap rates respond to the consultation, because ISDA will not be able to publish documentation to implement these fallbacks unless we have sufficient support. And as we'll also come on to later, the level of support that we receive pursuant to this consultation will dictate whether we implement the fallbacks as a supplement to the ISDA definitions or in a new version of the definitions once we come on to the 2021 definitions, or whether we exclusively publish bilateral amendments that market participants can use. Respondents are also welcome to submit qualitative feedback regarding the fallback or any other information that they would like to provide. But I do want to emphasize that because of the work that has been done on these fallbacks in the ARRC and in the NLTF, we are taking a streamlined approach with this consultation. And so to the extent your firm has been following this work, it should hopefully not be a huge resource constraint to respond to the yes or no question. Responses are due a week from Friday, so on Friday, July 2nd, and we are not going to be able to extend that deadline because particularly for the sterling LIBOR ICE swap rate, time is really of the essence to move forward with the implementation of these fallbacks. So on today's webinar, we're going to give some background on the work of the NLTF and the ARRC. We're going to explain how the fallbacks are composed, so what inputs are used for the fallback rate. We're also going to explain how the fallbacks will be drafted into the ISDA documentation, and in particular into the rate options for the 2006 definitions, and similar provisions ultimately in the 2021 definitions, as well as how the fallbacks will be drafted into the relevant settlement provisions. In the consultation, you can actually look at near final language for the amendments to the 2006 definitions. ISDA has already worked with its working groups to resolve the primary technical issues related to that drafting, and so respondents to the consultation can actually review precisely how the fallbacks will be drafted when they're responding to the consultation. So before I turn it over to our other panelists, I'll just say one thing about that implementation. As mentioned, time is of the essence for implementation of the fallbacks for the sterling LIBOR ICE swap rate, and that's because IBA, the administrator of that rate, which is also, as we know, the administrator for LIBOR in all 5 currencies, is currently consulting on the cessation of the sterling LIBOR ICE swap rate, and that rate will be impacted by the cessation and or non-representative publication that we know will occur for sterling LIBOR at the end of this year. The timeline is slightly more extended for a US dollar LIBOR ICE swap rate because it is expected to potentially continue for a longer period, given that US dollar LIBOR's publication will continue for a longer period. However, we wanted to consult on these fallbacks together so that the fallbacks for the US dollar LIBOR ICE swap rate are ready when the market needs them. And importantly, as we'll come on to, when all of the components for the US dollar LIBOR ICE swap rate fallback are available, and those components include a SOFR ICE swap rate, which is not yet available. So with that background, I'm going to pass it over to Arif to start on the next slide.
Thanks, Anne, and many thanks to ISDA for organising this webinar and for inviting me to speak on what is a very important topic for the sterling and US dollar non-linear derivatives market. As we approach the cessation dates for panel bank sterling and US dollar LIBOR at the end of 2021 and the end of June 2023 respectively, the UK authorities continue to support the industry in transitioning legacy LIBOR positions. My name is Arif Merali, as Anne said, and I'm a senior advisor in the risk-free rate transition team at the Bank of England. Prior to joining the bank, I spent nearly 25 years trading interest rate derivatives at various investment banks, including the last 15 years in sterling markets. The Working Group on Sterling Risk-Free Reference Rates was set up by the Bank of England in 2015. Its objective is to catalyse a broad-based transition to SONIA by the end of 2021 across sterling bond, loan and derivative markets in order to reduce the financial stability risks arising from the widespread reliance on LIBOR. The working group is formed of a diverse group of market participants and trade associations, including ISDA, of course, and represents relevant sectors and markets. The Bank of England and the Financial Conduct Authority, or FCA, participate as ex officio members and provide administrative support via the working group secretariat. You can find all the working group publications and information via the Bank of England website. Last summer, the working group convened a non-linear task force, or NLTF, to focus on transition in sterling non-linear derivative markets. ISDA are also an active member of the NLTF. Before I go on to the work of the NLTF, and in particular their work on fallbacks for the sterling LIBOR ICE swap rate, I would first like to mention ISDA's earlier work on fallbacks in derivatives for various IBOR currencies, including sterling LIBOR and US dollar LIBOR. After several years of market consultation, ISDA launched the IBOR Fallback Supplement and Protocol in January this year. This applies fallbacks to new and legacy sterling and US dollar LIBOR contracts based on compounded in arrears SONIA or SOFR respectively, plus a fixed spread adjustment to account for the economic difference between LIBOR and risk-free rates, or RFRs. The fixed spread adjustment is calculated using the 5-year historic median of the difference between LIBOR and the corresponding risk-free rate compounded over the same tenor. The official sector and the working group in the UK have strongly encouraged adherence to the ISDA protocol, as have the US official sector and their working group, the Alternative Reference Rates Committee, or ARRC. This will ensure widespread adoption of these fallbacks in derivative contracts, and to date, over 14,000 firms have signed up globally. For sterling markets, approximately 85% of bilateral derivatives on a notional basis are now covered by the ISDA protocol. And if one includes clear derivatives, where the CCPs will adopt ISDA-style fallbacks as part of their rulebook, then over 97% of sterling derivatives are covered by the new fallbacks. This is a very positive outcome, and we are extremely grateful to ISDA for their work, but there are still many firms who are yet to adhere. We note that the protocol is still open for adherence, and we encourage firms who are yet to adhere to do so before the end of the year. Returning to the work of the NLTF. In September last year, the NLTF identified an open market infrastructure issue that may arise from the permanent discontinuation of the sterling LIBOR swap rate, or sterling LIBOR ISR, which could have implications for cash-settled swaptions, as well as other products such as constant maturity swaps that rely on the sterling LIBOR ISR as part of their settlement process. The ISDA fallback supplement and protocol do not apply to the sterling LIBOR ISR, and the current contemplated fallback uses calculation agent or reference bank poll, which may not function if the ISR is permanently discontinued following the cessation of LIBOR. An exchange of letters last autumn between the working group and ICE Benchmark Administration, or IBA, flagged these issues and discussed a solution whereby a fallback to the sterling LIBOR ISR could be constructed using the SONIA ISR, with an adjustment for the credit spread, such as the same fixed spread adjustment used in the ISDA fallback supplement and protocol. The NLTF, IBA, and ISDA agreed to engage and explore this further. In February this year, the working group published a white paper detailing the work of the NLTF on this topic. As mentioned earlier, the paper is available on the working group web pages, and the link is on the slide. Before I go into the detail of the paper, I must just point out that as the Bank of England and FCA are ex officio members of the working group and its associated subgroups, the work and output of the NLTF do not constitute guidance or legal advice from the Bank of England, PRA, or FCA, and are not necessarily endorsed by the bank or the FCA. So the white paper showed how a fallback for the sterling LIBOR ISR could be constructed using three building blocks. These are the SONIA ISR for the relevant tenor published by IBA, the same fixed spread adjustment used by ISDA in the fallback supplement and protocol as published by Bloomberg, and a convexity adjustment to compensate for the different payment frequencies between the fixed and floating legs of the SONIA ISRs and the sterling LIBOR ISRs. The exact derivation of the formula used is detailed in the white paper, and John from ISDA will cover the convexity adjustments in more detail next. Market participants, however, should note that this formula is intended to be used only after the end of 2021, once sterling LIBOR has permanently ceased or become unrepresentative, and the sterling LIBOR ISR is expected to be unavailable or discontinued. This is due to the potential difference between the fixed ISDA spreads and the prevailing market spreads between sterling LIBOR and compounded SONIA prior to the end of 2021. The NLTF also conducted backtesting of the formula and found that any differences were very small, I think less than 0.2 of a basis point. Even under extreme stress tests, the largest differences were still reasonably small, and that was in times of very high rates and very steep yield curves. Prior to publishing the white paper, the NLTF did consider alternative versions of the formula, including a simplified version without the convexity adjustment. But the group's view was that these alternatives did not perform as well in the backtesting and stress testing analysis, and did not minimize potential economic transfer of value. NLTF members voted on the final approach, and the motion was passed with no objections. Just to remind everyone, the NLTF consists of 25 firms, including representatives from both the buy side and the sell side, as well as ISDA. The white paper also went through the usual governance procedures, which included being signed off by the main working group prior to being published on the Bank of England website, although I will note that it is not a non-binding recommendation. On the 5th of May this year, IBA began publishing the Sterling SONIA spread-adjusted ISR in beta form, based on the formula set out in the white paper. John, Phoebe and Anne will discuss later how, subject to the results of the consultation, this fallback rate may be applied to legacy contracts once it is available for widespread use. One feature of the transition away from LIBOR has been the importance of maintaining consistency amongst jurisdictions wherever possible. We, as regulators, maintain a continuous dialogue with our counterparts in other LIBOR jurisdictions, and there are regular calls between the chairs of the national working groups. The work to develop fallbacks for the LIBOR ISR is an excellent example of this coordinated approach. The NLTF held regular calls with a subcommittee of the ARRC in the US, supported by members of the Bank, FCA and Federal Reserve, to share and discuss its work and analysis. This resulted in the ARRC subcommittee publishing its own white paper, detailing a similar approach for a fallback for the US dollar LIBOR ISR. The ARRC white paper outlined the derivation of a formula that could be used for the dollar LIBOR ISR based on the same three building blocks: a potential SOFR ICE swap rate, the fixed ISDA spread adjustment for 3-month US dollar LIBOR, and a convexity adjustment to account for the different payment frequencies between a US dollar LIBOR swap and a SOFR swap. However, the convexity adjustment was slightly more involved because it also had to take into account the difference in day count conventions between a US dollar LIBOR swap and a SOFR swap. Again, the derivation of the formula can be found in the ARRC paper, and John will discuss the convexity adjustments in more detail after me. As for the NLTF formula, the ARRC formula can only be used after the end of June 2023, once 3-month US dollar LIBOR has become non-representative, even if the US dollar LIBOR ISR has been discontinued prior to that date. As I said earlier, this is a very important topic for the nonlinear derivatives market in the UK and the US. The consultation is the culmination of 9 months of work across both jurisdictions to insert robust fallbacks into derivative contracts that reference the ICE swap rates ahead of the cessation of LIBOR. We would encourage market participants to review all the information in the consultation paper, as well as the supporting papers from the NLTF and the ARRC, to perform their own analysis and to respond accordingly to the ISDA consultation by the 2nd of July. Finally, we would like to thank ISDA again for all their work on this topic and performing another vital role in the transition away from LIBOR to risk-free rates. I'll hand over to John.
Thanks, Arif. So firstly, the ICE swap rates published by IBA represent the mid-market fixed rate for fixed floating interest rate swaps. So for sterling LIBOR ICE swap rates, they're published around 11 a.m. London time, representing swaps with a floating leg of 3 months where the tenor is 1 year, and 6 months where the tenor is greater than 1 year. And for US dollar swaps, it's published around 11 a.m. Eastern time, representing fixed floating swaps where the floating leg is 3-month USD LIBOR. IBA started publishing a SONIA ICE swap rate in December 2020, based similarly on fixed float swaps, but where the floating leg references SONIA compounded in arrears over a 12-month period. And it's also expected that IBA will publish a SOFR ICE swap rate when volumes of SOFR swaps is sufficient. And as we know, the fallbacks for sterling and US dollar LIBOR swaps under Supplement 70, the IBOR fallback supplement, are based on a SONIA SOFR compounded in arrears over the applicable period, plus a spread adjustment that is published by Bloomberg. So on the face of it, you might think that given the fallback for sterling and USD, LIBOR is compounded SONIA SOFR plus a spread adjustment, that you can just apply the same spread adjustment to the SONIA and SOFR ICE swap rates, and that would be a good enough fallback to the sterling and US dollar LIBOR ICE swap rates. That approach, however, would not take into account the differences in payment frequencies and day count fractions between the LIBOR and the RFR-based swaps, and would therefore result in a potential value transfer. So, for example, on some of the differences for sterling LIBOR, the fixed legs, as I mentioned, is 1 year is annual for swaps of 1 year, semi-annual for swaps greater than 1 year, and on the floating leg is quarterly for swaps of 1 year and semi-annually for swaps greater than 1 year, whereas SONIA is annual. And for USD LIBOR is semi-annual on the fixed leg and quarterly on the floating leg, and again, SOFR is expected to be annual. Also, for US dollar swaps, USD LIBOR uses 30 over 360 day count fraction on the fixed leg, whereas the SOFR swaps use the actual over 360 day count fraction for the fixed leg. So basically, adjustments need to be made to account for the differences in order to construct a fallback to the relevant LIBOR swap rates using the relevant RFR swap rates. And that is what the formulas that have been published by the UK Nonlinear Task Force and the ARRC do. So the working groups in developing these formulas relied on 3 basic key principles. One, consistency with the fallback rates under Supplement 70, the IBOR fallback supplement, the avoidance of value transfer and disincentives to adopt the formula, and also simplicity and transparency of the formula. And also on the US dollar side, obviously the assumption that the SOFR swap rate, when developed, will be annual payments with actual 360 day count basis on both the fixed and the float legs. So there are some differences between the two formulas, and I'm not going to go into and derive them here. You can see that clearly set out in the white papers published by the Nonlinear Task Force and the ARRC. As I say, the differences in the formulas really come from the fact that US dollar and sterling LIBOR swaps have different payment frequencies and day count fractions. Obviously, the main difference is that there is no difference in the day count fraction between sterling LIBOR and SONIA swaps. They both use the actual over 365 day count fraction. So the UK formula only needs to adjust for the difference in payment frequencies. And the sterling formula, as I mentioned, there's different payment conventions depending on whether the tenor is 1 year or greater. So therefore, there's different formulas representing a tenor of 1 year and tenors of greater than 1 year. Also, there is some simplification assumptions that have been made so that the formulas have only one variable, which is the SONIA and the SOFR swap rates. Obviously, the spreads are fixed spreads. So there's some assumptions that have been made to simplify that. So there is only one variable in the formulas. And also in the US dollar formula, the 365.25 number that you see there represents an approximation of the actual number of days in the year, obviously the 0.25 because of leap years. So finally, the Brattle Group, which is an independent consultancy firm, reviewed the formulas and published a report in May stating that they found the formulas to be a fair and reasonable way to account for the differences in the payment frequencies and the day count fractions, and that they did not identify any circumstances that would suggest any meaningful value transfer that would result from this approach. So yeah, now I'll hand it over to Phoebe, who will go into some of the legal terms.
Thanks, Jonathan, and hi, everyone. So I'm going to speak about the implementation of the fallbacks in ISDA documentation. But before explaining how the new fallbacks would work in ISDA's documentation, I thought it would be useful to briefly outline where the GBP LIBOR and USD LIBOR swap rates are currently referenced in the 2006 ISDA definitions, and what the current fallbacks are for those rates in the existing version of the 2006 ISDA definitions. So the GBP LIBOR and USD LIBOR swap rates are broadly referenced in two ways in the 2006 definitions. Firstly, there are what we call rate options, which are in section 7.1 of the 2006 definitions. And we have these for both the GBP LIBOR ICE swap rate and the USD LIBOR ICE swap rate. And these rate options tend to be used in constant maturity swaps. Now, there are also rate options for many different interest rates in the 2006 ISDA definitions. For example, as you will likely know, there are rate options for GBP LIBOR and USD LIBOR as well. But it's worth highlighting, as Anne mentioned earlier, that the rate options for the GBP LIBOR ICE swap rate and the USD LIBOR ICE swap rate are entirely separate to the GBP LIBOR and USD LIBOR rate options, because the ICE swap rates are different benchmarks to LIBOR, even though they're calculated by reference to LIBOR swaps. So as you will hopefully already be aware, and as Arif mentioned earlier, ISDA has published the IBOR Fallbacks Supplement and the 2020 IBOR Fallbacks Protocol, which updated the rate options for various IBORs, including GBP LIBOR and USD LIBOR, to include new fallbacks. But those documents did not cover the ICE swap rates, and so the fallbacks for the ICE swap rates have not yet been updated by ISDA to make them more robust. So what are the existing fallbacks for the ICE swap rates in the 2006 ISDA definitions? So the existing fallbacks for the GBP LIBOR ICE swap rate option is to calculation agent determination. And this applies whenever the rate is not available on the screen. So that would be regardless of whether there were a temporary or permanent discontinuation of the GBP LIBOR ICE swap rate. The existing fallbacks for the USD LIBOR ICE swap rate options are slightly different, and these are to a reference bank poll, which means that the calculation agent would have to go out and ask reference banks to provide quotations for the swap rate. And the existing USD LIBOR ICE swap rate options do not tell parties what to do in the event that reference banks fail to provide those quotations. And this is problematic because reference banks are not expected to provide those quotations if US dollar LIBOR has been discontinued, such that US dollar LIBOR swaps are no longer being entered into. So these rate options in section 7.1 of the 2006 ISDA definitions are the first area where the ICE swap rates are referenced in the 2006 definitions. The second way in which the ICE swap rates are referenced in the 2006 definitions is as the settlement rate. And this is relevant for both section 13.9 of the 2006 definitions, which deals with automatic exercise and fallback exercise in respect of a swaption. And here the ICE swap rate is used to determine whether the buyer of a GBP or USD swaption is in the money and therefore whether the swaption is exercised. And then separately, the ICE swap rate is also referenced in section 18 of the 2006 definitions, which deals with cash settlement for both swaptions and swaps to which optional early termination or mandatory early termination applies. And here the ICE swap rate is used to determine the settlement amount. So Jonathan will come on to speak about the practical implications of this use of the ICE swap rate in swaptions later. So the existing fallbacks for references to the ICE swap rate in section 13.9 and section 18 of the 2006 definitions are slightly different to the existing fallbacks in the rate options in section 7.1, which I described earlier. So what are the existing fallbacks where the ICE swap rate is used as the settlement rate? Well, firstly, there is a fallback to reference bank poll. And as I previously mentioned, this is not expected to work because reference banks are not expected to provide quotations for a LIBOR-based swap rate once LIBOR is discontinued or non-representative. And the provisions then say that if fewer than 3 quotations are provided, there's a further fallback to calculation agent determination of the rate or determination of the rate by the seller of the swaption for the purposes of automatic exercise and fallback exercise. So those are the existing references to the ICE swap rates in the 2006 definitions and the existing fallbacks. So if we can move to the next slide. So the next question is, how will all of this change if ISDA implements these new fallbacks, which we've been discussing and which the consultation relate to? So the new fallbacks will apply if an index cessation event and an index cessation effective date occur in relation to the relevant tenor of the underlying LIBOR rate. So GBP LIBOR for the GBP LIBOR I swap rate and USD LIBOR for the USD LIBOR I swap rate. So you may already be familiar with the terms indexation event and indexation effective date from the IBOR fallback supplement and protocol. But if not, for these purposes, this basically means that in order for the new I swap rate fallbacks to apply, the relevant LIBOR in the relevant tenor needs to have been permanently discontinued or become non-representative as announced by the UK Financial Conduct Authority. So as I'm sure you're aware, the Financial Conduct Authority did make a statement on the 5th of March 2021, which constituted an indexation event for GBP LIBOR and USD LIBOR. And so assuming that nothing changes, for the purposes of the new I swap rate fallbacks, there would be an indexation effective date for GBP LIBOR in the relevant tenor on the first London banking day on or after the 1st of January 2022. And there would be an indexation effective date for US dollar LIBOR in the relevant tenor on the first London banking day on or after 1st of July 2023. And that's because these are the dates on which GBP LIBOR and USD LIBOR respectively will be permanently discontinued or be non-representative. So if the new fallbacks are implemented by ISDA, then as from those dates, references to the GBP LIBOR I swap rate and the USD LIBOR I swap rate in the sections of the 2006 definitions that I described earlier will fall back to either a published fallback rate, or if there is no published fallback rate, a calculated fallback rate. So the published fallback rate will be defined by reference to a rate calculated in accordance with the formula suggested by the NLTF or the ARRC, which John and Arif have previously outlined, and published on a screen. And IBA has already started publishing a published fallback rate for the GBP LIBOR I swap rate. And this is called the GBP SONIA spread adjusted swap rate, and it's currently available in beta form. In terms of US dollar, the SOFR I swap rate has not yet been developed, but it's anticipated that it will be. And so it's possible that there will also be an all-in published fallback rate for the USD LIBOR I swap rate too. If there is no published fallback rate for any reason, including if it doesn't exist or if it's temporarily unavailable, then we have this further fallback to a calculated fallback rate. And that's defined to include the full formula suggested by the NLTF for GBP and by the ARRC for US dollar. So the fallback rate would then be calculated in accordance with that formula, which is going to be set out in the provisions by the calculation agent. So that's how the new fallbacks would work. And I just wanted to reiterate a point which has been raised earlier, which is that if the GBP LIBOR or USD LIBOR I swap rate is unavailable before the relevant LIBOR has been permanently discontinued or is non-representative, then the existing fallbacks, which I described earlier, would continue to apply. So either a reference bank poll or calculation agent determination, or both, depending on which section of the 2006 definition is relevant. And that's in line with the NLTF and ARRC papers on fallbacks for the I swap rates, which suggested that the new fallback rate should only be used if the relevant LIBOR is permanently discontinued or non-representative. So I'm conscious that's quite a lot of detail to take in about how the documentation currently works and how it will work subject to the consultation were the new fallbacks to be incorporated. But hopefully the slides provide a useful point of reference, and the consultation paper itself also covers this information. So I'll now pass on to Jonathan, who's going to briefly discuss the practical implication of use of the fallback rates in the settlement rate provisions.
Yeah, so I mean, most people think of the fallbacks as applying to floating rate options, but obviously, one of the key uses of the I swap rate in the is the 2006 definitions, and also in the 2021 definitions, which has just been published, is for the settlement rate. And as Phoebe mentioned, the settlement rate is what is used to determine the cash settlement amount of a swaption if under certain cash settlement methods, and those cash settlement methods are par yield curve unadjusted or collateralized cash price. Par yield curve unadjusted is generally used in the UK market, That's the default in the ISDA settlement matrix. Collateralized cash price method is used generally in the US market, and I think there probably will be some sterling swaps that probably use that as well. Under those methods, the cash settlement amount is determined by looking at the settlement rate and the difference in the present value between an annuity of the fixed amounts and an annuity of those fixed amounts if that fixed rate was replaced by the settlement rate. So obviously the settlement rate is very important for swaptions that use those two methods. And currently in the ISDA definitions for the settlement rate, the fallback is to reference bank quotations. And if you get insufficient reference bank quotations, it goes to calculation agent determination. So it's really the same issue as you have with the iSwap rate floating rate options, in that there's not a very robust fallback there at the moment. So the purpose, basically the same is applying via these changes to implement a robust fallback that uses the formulas that have been developed by the ARRC and the nonlinear task force to incorporate those in as fallbacks for the settlement rate. And that will obviously produce a more robust fallback. And as I say, that really for sterling swaps, that really is applicable for par yield curve unadjusted cash settlement method, and for US dollar swaps, collateralized cash price, and also for swaps that use cleared physical settlement, as collateralized cash price is the fallback to cleared physical settlement if that clearinghouse does not accept those swaps for clearing.
Anne's going to come on to speak about the criteria for the consultation in a moment, but before she does that, I'll just explain how the amendments to include the new fallbacks could be implemented, because as Anne will explain below, this is dependent on the results of the consultation. So ISDA has explained in its consultation paper that there are essentially two possible ways in which the new fallbacks could be implemented. Firstly, ISDA could implement the new fallbacks by way of a supplement to the 2006 ISDA definitions. And this would have the effect of automatically including the new fallbacks in new transactions that incorporate the 2006 ISDA definitions and are entered into on or after the date on which that supplement is published. However, that would leave legacy transactions entered into before the supplement is published, which would not include the new fallbacks, and they'd instead be based on the 2006 definitions as amended and supplemented through to the date on which those legacy transactions were entered into. So if ISDA does publish a supplement to include the new fallbacks in new transactions, then it would also publish a template amendment agreement that could be used by parties to bilaterally negotiate amendments to existing legacy transactions that incorporate the 2006 ISDA definitions and reference the GBP LIBOR or USD LIBOR ICE swap rates. So that approach of using a supplement to the 2006 definitions for new transactions and a bilateral template amendment agreement for legacy transactions is set out as option 1 on the slide. The second option for implementation of the new fallbacks is not to publish a supplement to the 2006 definitions and to only publish a template amendment agreement that could be used by parties to bilaterally negotiate amendments to include the new fallbacks in both new and existing transactions. So this would mean that the new fallbacks will not be automatically included in any transactions, and parties would need to include the new fallbacks by negotiating bilaterally for all transactions. So as I mentioned, which option is used and whether or not a supplement to the 2006 ISDA definitions will be drafted and published by ISDA will depend on the feedback to the consultation and in accordance with the criteria specified in the consultation. So I'm now going to pass on to Anne, who's going to explain that criteria in detail by reference to the next slide.
Thanks, Phoebe. So I've set out here the criteria that is in the consultation. I would encourage you to look at the actual consultation to see the full version of the criteria, but I will walk through it at the high level set out on this slide. So in order for ISDA to be confident that a broad enough segment of the market across multiple classes of market participants supports use of these fallbacks, and specifically supports use of them via a supplement and or a new version of the 2021 definitions that will apply to all new transactions incorporating those definitions. We need at least 25 respondents to this consultation, and at least a quarter or 25% of those respondents must not be dealers or infrastructure providers. And that's to ensure that both sides of the market support these fallbacks. Based on that number of respondents, or whatever number we receive, we need at least 65% of respondents to support the fallbacks that are set forth in the documents attached to the consultation. And at least a quarter of those who support the fallbacks also need to not be dealers or infrastructure providers. And again, given how automatically, in a sense, a supplement or a new version of the definitions would be, it's important that we have more than a majority of the market, and we've set that threshold at 65%. As I mentioned, respondents to this consultation only need to answer a yes or no question, but they do have the opportunity to provide feedback. And specifically, we've asked respondents to confirm that they would not be unavoidably harmed by the implementation of these fallbacks. And we need to make sure that no market segment, for example, all insurance companies, all asset managers, these are not fallbacks that would unavoidably harm a segment of the market. Just to be clear, based on the work that the ARRC and the NLTF, as well as the independent review of the Brattle Group, we are not aware of any such harm. However, the point of this consultation and what's really critical at this juncture is for market participants themselves to review the fallbacks, review the documentation, and just confirm that we would not be doing anything that would harm a segment of the market. So Phoebe also mentioned that it's possible that if ISDA does not have the support to publish a supplement, we would just publish a template pursuant to which counterparties could agree that even though the fallbacks don't apply, the fallbacks are going to apply both if they enter into a new transaction referencing the relevant ICE swap rates, as well as amending their legacy transactions. So we've set a lower bar for doing that because it would be much easier for any market participants who don't want these fallbacks to avoid use of them if they are only available via a template. So, but we still do set a threshold because once ISDA publishes something and makes it available to the market on its website, we still do need to do a certain level of diligence. And so if we have at least 15 respondents, 10% of which are not dealers or infrastructure providers, and 50%, so we are looking at the straight majority there, support the fallback, and at least 10% of those who support it are not dealers or infrastructure providers, then we would be comfortable and able to publish those templates, provided again that we're not unavoidably harming any segment of the market. So that criteria is important because it would be, as Arif said, an unfortunate scenario if the market does not have access to fallbacks for these ICE swap rates, and that's because, as Phoebe described, the current fallbacks are to a calculation agent determination, which would be exceedingly difficult, or a reference bank poll, which is not expected to work. And so, therefore, if we don't have the ability to implement these fallbacks, it's likely that there will need to be additional industry work, and time is really of the essence. So again, please do let ISDA know if these fallbacks will be problematic, because that is something we need to know prior to implementation. But if you do support these fallbacks, it is critical that you respond. We cannot take silence or non-response as support. We need to know that the market supports these. So if you do have questions, we are going to use the remainder of the time to answer questions. One thing that I did want to point out before we get to the questions is when we talk about the template for amending legacy documents that reference the relevant ICE swap rate, that would be similar to the protocol and templates that incorporate supplement 70, which is the IBOR fallback supplement, or the supplement that implements the IBOR fallback, in the sense that it would just say that irrespective of the date that the transaction was entered into, it is going to include the fallback provision. So the amended and restated rate options and the updated settlement provisions. We are, while this consultation is outstanding, considering changes that have been made to the settlement provisions over the last few years, particularly as they relate to settlement of swaptions. And the template that we publish, assuming that we publish something, will look to account for those differences and enable counterparties who want the new fallback but don't want to change which other supplements apply to their settlement provisions can do so. So we don't have a specific strategy for that yet, but I did want to acknowledge in response to some questions that we've received that that is something we're looking into at the implementation stage. So I'm now going to turn to the questions. We received a question, and I think this is pretty straightforward. If a product references both LIBOR and one of the swap rates, does the IBOR fallback protocol amend the LIBOR references in that transaction? And the answer is yes. So if you have a transaction that references both benchmarks, and you and your counterparty have adhered to the IBOR fallbacks protocol, or that transaction was entered into after Supplement 70 took effect, then you have fallbacks for LIBOR. You don't have fallbacks for the ICE swap rate, but you'll be able to agree to fallbacks for the ICE swap rate, assuming that ISDA publishes these fallbacks. And doing so will add the fallbacks for the swap rates and will not do anything to disturb or disrupt or change the fallbacks that you've already agreed to for the LIBOR references. So the next question we received is about the timeline for adoption. So for the sterling ICE swap rate, given that the components of the fallback are available, as John and Arif and Phoebe described, we would look to publish, assuming a positive response to this consultation, we would look to publish whatever documentation we are going to be publishing as soon as possible after the July 2nd deadline. I'm hoping that it will be a matter of weeks, not months. We're looking to do that very soon so that market participants can have that in place by the end of the year. For US dollar, the expected approach is that everything will be ready if this is a positive consultation, and we will publish that documentation once the SOFR ICE swap rate is available in a non-beta form. And so we don't have a date for that, but it would be ready, and that's the date on which we would implement them. There was also a question about the simplification of the formula for the convexity adjustment. I think that question came in really before Arif talked about that in his remarks and before Jonathan talked about it. As Arif mentioned, the Nonlinear Task Force, as well as the ARRC subcommittee, did consider not using a convexity adjustment or a simplified formula, and based on the back testing, did not adopt that approach. So I would suggest if reaching out to members of those committees if you have questions about that, or just looking at the back testing that was provided for the formula that was adopted, as well as the Brattle report, to see the technical accuracy of those formulas, and then perhaps analyzing the more simple approach in the context of the technical accuracy that's gained from the formulas that are being suggested. We had a question about the formulas that John mentioned. Those formulas were not in the slides. However, they are available in the ARRC and NLTF reports. You can read about them in the Brattle report. And then as Phoebe described, because a portion of the fallback utilizes a calculation agent application of those formulas, you can also see them in the draft documents. We had a question about, is there any expectation that a similar process will be developed for the Japanese yen swap rates? So Refinitiv publishes Tokyo swap rates, or TSRs, based on transactions that reference both yen LIBOR swaps and TIBOR swaps. So taking the former yen LIBOR swaps, Refinitiv recently consulted on fallbacks for yen LIBOR swaps that would utilize a TONA swap rate as well as similar adjustments. Refinitiv has not published the results of that consultation, but we have been in communication with them. As I mentioned, the approach that ISDA is taking with respect to these fallbacks critically relies on the work of the ARRC and the NLTF. So we're currently engaged in discussions with the relevant working group in Japan as well as Refinitiv regarding how work is expected to proceed. And if there is a similar approach taken with respect to the results of the Refinitiv consultation, then ISDA expects to be able to follow a similar process for the Tokyo swap rates. We understand that time is very important and not necessarily on our side when it comes to the yen LIBOR Tokyo swap rate. So hopefully there will be some developments in the coming weeks and we'll have a specific strategy to share, but we're just waiting for some developments in that jurisdiction. So I'm gonna turn quickly to John for the next question. I think he mentioned some of the products that reference the swap rates, but John, if you could just reiterate those in response to one of the questions we received.
Yeah, sure. Obviously, the main ones are swaptions that reference the settlement rate, that use the settlement rate, and that's if you're using, as I said, the par yield curve unadjusted, or the collateralized cash price methodologies for your cash settlement amount method for your swaptions, because both of those methods use the settlement rate, and in the ISDA definitions that will default to the ISWAP rate, and if the ISWAP rate is not published, then it goes to reference banks, and then if not sufficient reference banks provide quotations, it goes to calculation agent determination. But no, you can also, some market participants may be using those collateralized cash price for optional early terminations. So you would need to look at where you're using the collateralized cash price cash settlement method. So I know a few counterparties do use that for their optional early terminations and their mandatory early terminations. And obviously the ISWAP rate is the floating rate options that reference the ISWAP rates are generally used for CMS, constant maturity swap products. So that's really the main uses of the swap rates where they're used in the ISDA definitions. So in the ISDA definitions, the ISWAP rate is used in the ISWAP rate floating rate options, obviously, and in the settlement rate for currencies where there is an ISWAP rate. And the main products are CMS, swaptions, cash settled swaptions, physically settled, cleared physical settled swaptions where the fallback has been triggered, because that will fall back to collateralized cash price. And then also you need to look at optional early terminations where you've potentially used some of those cash settlement methodologies.
Thanks, John. So looking through the questions, we also received a question about the euro swap rates. IBA also publishes a euro swap rate that is based on transactions referencing Euribor. So right now, given that Euribor is expected to continue at least in the near term, and IBA does not have stated plans for a euro STR swap rate, we don't have any immediate plans to implement fallbacks for the Euribor-based ICE swap rate. Of course, if things evolve in the Eurozone related to any of those rates, we would work with the Euro risk-free rate working group and presumably take that work forward if and when appropriate. We had a question about what would happen if the US dollar LIBOR ICE swap rates become unavailable prior to the US dollar LIBOR cessation event. And as we've said on this webinar several times, the fallbacks that were implemented will be triggered and applied based on cessation or non-representative publication of US dollar LIBOR, even if that occurs after the swap rate is unavailable. So if that does happen, the current fallbacks for the US dollar LIBOR ICE swap rate will apply. And I'm going to turn it to Phoebe to just reiterate what those fallbacks are and that they would apply in the interim period before the new fallbacks apply.
Yeah, thanks, Anne. So this depends on on which section of the 2006 definitions we're talking about. So if you're talking about the US dollar LIBOR ICE swap rate options, then the existing fallback in those is to a reference bank poll. And as I mentioned before, for the US dollar LIBOR ICE swap rate options, it doesn't tell you what to do currently if there is no reference bank poll or the calculation agent is unable to get quotes from reference banks. But remember that if the new fallbacks are implemented, this fallback will only apply while USD LIBOR is still available, and so quotes for US dollar LIBOR swaps should still be available at that point in time. In terms of the use of the US dollar LIBOR ICE swap rate in the settlement rate provisions, so that's in section 18 and also in section 13.9 of the 2006 definitions, there's a slightly different fallback. So the first fallback is to a reference bank poll, which, as we've just explained, the calculation agent would be required to go out and get quotes from reference banks. And then there is a further fallback. So the provisions basically say that if fewer than 3 quotations are provided, then you fall back to calculation agent determination of the rate. So those are the existing fallbacks. And as Anne mentioned, those would continue to apply under the new fallback wording, but only to the extent that the US dollar LIBOR ICE swap rate's unavailable before LIBOR is non-representative or discontinued.
Thanks, Phoebe. We also had a question about how this will work operationally and if the fallbacks will automatically apply to any transactions, just like the IBOR fallbacks apply to any transactions entered into after the effective and deemed publication date of Supplement 70. So if we implement these fallbacks via a supplement, then any transactions entered into on or after the effective or deemed publication date of that supplement will contain the fallbacks, just like transactions contain the IBOR fallback. If we don't receive support for that approach and instead publish a template that counterparties would use to agree that the fallbacks apply to both their legacy and any new transactions they enter, then you would need to have agreed to the terms of that bilateral amendment before the fallbacks apply, or alternatively, you could, agree in a paper confirmation to the terms of the new fallbacks, but they would not be automatic like Supplement 70. So I guess to be straightforward with respect to that question, whether these fallbacks apply automatically depends on how we implement them, and how we implement them depends on the responses to this consultation.
And if we implement via a supplement to the 2006 definitions, then we're obviously the 2021 definitions have been published, and we will also do the corresponding changes to the 2021 definitions. But that will obviously be because there's no supplements don't apply to the 2021 definition, so the whole booklet will get reversioned on the user platform. Encourage you to go and have a look at that if you haven't already.
Yeah, that's an important point. No more supplements, but we can reversion. There is also a question about calculation of the rate using the formula if ICE doesn't go live with the rate that's currently in beta form, or if hypothetically they never publish a fallback rate for the US dollar ICE swap rate. So as Phoebe described in the documents, it's already drafted that if that fallback rate published by IBA is not ever available in a non-beta form, then it's automatic that the calculation agent performs the calculation. So if that rate were never available out of beta form, or for some reason it was pulled by IBA, you would have the ability contractually to utilize the fallback by the calculation agent performing the calculation. And for US dollar LIBOR, since there's not even a beta form, assuming that there was at least a SOFR ICE swap rate, but there was never a published form, you would just always use the calculation agent calculation of the fallback. And then if and when there is a tradable fallback, tradable all-in fallback rate, that would apply as priority to the calculation. Now, of course, the expectation is you get the same result with both approaches, but we've drafted in this way just in case anything happens to prevent the availability of these all-in fallback rates. We continue to receive a number of questions about the availability of the formulas. If you click on the links to the ARRC and the NLTF paper that were in the slides for today's webinar and that are also available in the consultation, that will take you to the formulas. And I suggest that you look at those if you're interested in the formulas itself. I think we are now out of time. So we should be able to follow up by email if we didn't get your question. If you have other questions after today's webinar, or if you're viewing this webinar at a different time and want to submit questions, please either submit them to benchmarkreform@isda.org or fallbackconsult@isda.org. Thank you for joining today, and thank you very much to all of my fellow panelists.